Recently, I was having coffee with a young friend. My young friend was seeking both advice and connections. You see, my friend was perplexed. He had spent some $8,000 on lawyers, consultants, and filing fees to start a not-for-profit, and he didn't yet have enough donations for it to be self-sustaining. So I asked the young man, "What's your nonprofit about?" He said, "Feeding homeless people." "So," I asked, with a slight chuckle, "well, how many sandwiches can you make for $8,000? My friend seemed confused. I explained to him that decades ago I volunteered for a not-for-profit in Hollywood. We had a suicide prevention hotline, provided 3 meals a day, and housing for at least 60 people every night. We did free drug rehab, rescued hookers from pimps and got their lives turned around, and on Wednesday night, we distributed several hundred sandwiches. On Wednesday mornings, restaurants, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce, local churches, and mostly private individuals dropped off groceries. On Wednesday afternoon, the staff made as many sandwiches as we could with the groceries on hand. On Wednesday night, we distributed hundreds of those sandwiches on Hollywood and Santa Monica boulevards to every hungry homeless and hooking person we could find. We had no paid executive director, no paid staff, no 4-color mailer, no paid fundraiser or grant writer. Just kind of asked ourselves, what would Jesus do? We used to talk about the fact that if every church, temple, and synagogue in America made and distributed 100 sandwiches once a week, there would be no starving or hungry people in America. Alas, I was not confused about my young friend. His interest was not in feeding the homeless. For him, this was just a hook. In America, there are millions of churches and not-for-profit organizations that receive property tax, parsonage tax, income tax exemptions, and their donors receive income tax breaks. In 1937, the U.S. Supreme Court found that these tax exemptions are given for good works churches and not-for-profits do in feeding hungry people, providing health care for the sick, sheltering homeless people, and generally ameliorating the effects of privation and poverty. And since the 1950s, they have been technically not allowed to be directly involved in politics. But churches and not-for-profits are not doing these good works. They are busily building real estate and investment portfolios and building payrolls of people who mostly support the institution itself rather than serve the needy. I believe we need a change. Tax breaks for the churches and not-for-profits must be deeds tested. The majority of funds raised must be expended directly on the mission of feeding, housing, clothing the poor, drug rehabilitation, real job training, re-entering prisoners to society, tending the sick, ill, and dying, and relieving the conditions of poverty. Every citizen and for-profit corporation is being taxed more than they would be, more than their fair share, in fact, because religious institutions and not-for-profits are getting a free ride. Now, that would be okay were they serving the functions they get the free ride for, but in the main, they are not, and we are all being taxed to fulfill those functions through government. So we outside the not-for-profit world are paying at least twice. And I guess you're wondering whatever became of that wonderful all-volunteer not-for-profit I worked with decades ago in Hollywood. Well, our founder and executive director fell in love and got married, and he needed a job and needed to hand off the not-for-profit to others. I know it was difficult for him, and despite being a very reserved person, he did amazingly great work. He raised $50,000 a year for the budget that really was the budget. He managed the staff and actually did redemptive work himself. So I guess in the end he was exhausted. But we did find an international not-for-profit that promised us the world in terms of funding they could bring to bear to accomplish our mission in Hollywood. Well, they got our donor list. One afternoon they fired all the volunteer staff, and then the next year they closed down all operations and created a lovely 4-color glossy print brochure and used it to raise millions of dollars a year on doing good works in Hollywood. Oddly though, they have no operations there. Not a dime raised by them is feeding, clothing, housing a single homeless kid, rescuing a hooker, or preventing a suicide. They raised almost $3 million through our old organization's name last year. Yes, that's painful for me to think of and even say. They're basically stealing $3 million a year from poor people and doing it with a name that used to serve them well. The not-for-profit industry needs to become accountable and brought to heel. The gravy train of high salaries and questionable, if any, deeds must come to an end.